Good evening and welcome to everyone. I am Director of Program, and in that capacity, it's my responsibility, one of them, to see that we have interesting and timely briefings for our members and the public. This year, you haven't had to listen to me because I've had wonderful leaguers organize the briefings and make the introductions. And I can also thank Peg Oldham for organizing this evening's briefing, but I have the pleasure of introducing it. There are a few announcements. This coming Friday, the 22nd at 10 a.m., we're having a meeting, a planning meeting for the rest of the year's briefings. And some people that are very involved in program are committed, but anyone is welcome. If any of you would like to tune in and bring some ideas on what you'd like to hear about, and if you don't want to tune in and want to send those to me, that would be great too. If you just want to tune in and listen, whatever, you're welcome. It's open to everyone. You do need to let Andrea Mitchell know so that she can send you the Zoom link. Our next briefing is February 15th, Monday, February 15th, organized by Sue Stark. We have a dynamic speaker, Denise Mayes. Since 2011, she has been the public policy director for the ACLU in Colorado. That's the American Civil Liberties Union, of course. I was interested in looking at her bio that she previously worked in the offices of President Obama and Vice President Biden. That briefing will continue the discussion we had started earlier in the year on civil rights policies and the police. And she will also be speaking about selective policing, which is policing differently in different situations. And I think she can probably, she's an expert in this field, can probably answer any of your questions related to these topics. Also, we have a group of Denver leaguers looking into some of these very issues on policing, and under the leadership of Assistant Director of Program, Barbara Allen Ford. That group is meeting by Zoom each month, at least that's their starting point. On Thursdays, the second and fourth Thursdays at 2 p.m. And if any of you are interested in tuning in on those discussions, they would love to have a few more people. And if you're interested, let Barbara know, Barbara Allen Ford in your roster, or we can email Fran and she'll get it to you. Now for tonight's program on housing and homelessness. I'm sure we've all been shocked and saddened by the growing number of homeless people on the streets of Denver. Tonight, we will learn that there is a plan in place, and that will hopefully be enhanced by ballot measure 2B, a sales tax to fund housing and homeless services, which Denver voters generously passed in November. In October 2019, the city of Denver established the Department of Housing Stability, HOST. The new department brought together existing investments and policies around housing and homelessness programs. They worked with development and services. HOST has convened more than 100 Denver stakeholders representing nonprofits, community organizations, developers, people with lived experience, city council members, government agency partners, funding partners, and businesses to develop an action plan. We have with us tonight Jennifer Bice, who is the Policy and Strategic Initiatives Manager for HOST. Would you put up her information, Andrea? Thank you, great. In that role, she supports the department's work on strategic planning, policy, and data and reporting. Jennifer will present on HOST's 2021 action plan and how the Homelessness Resolution Fund, newly established by ballot measure 2B, will advance the city's 2021 goals in hopes of creating a healthy, housed, and connected Denver. And hopefully she'll let us know how we might be able to help. Jennifer.
So Jennifer, I'm stopped sharing, so you should be able to share your presentation.
Thank you, Marty, so much for that great introduction. Let me just get my screen shared here real quick. Are you all seeing my screen?
I can.
Great.
Yes, very good.
All right. So just want to first say again, thank you so much for inviting me to come and speak with you all here tonight. Really great opportunity to be able to talk a little bit about what we've been doing here in the Department of Housing Stability and also opportunities that are coming up. So my remarks this evening will focus on our 2021 action plan and then kind of the layer on that we've added most recently around how we'll use the first year of Homelessness Resolution Fund, which was created by 2B. Then we'll talk a bit about kind of next steps and what's coming up and how we might engage this wonderful group. So just to start with a little bit of background, and Marty gave some of this already, which was wonderful. The Department of Housing Stability in the City and County of Denver is pretty new. We were created by executive order by Mayor Michael B. Hancock in October of 2019. So we're just over a year old at this point. But I really love this photo. It's from the signing of our executive order that created HOST as a department. And this quote from the mayor, "The end of the day, what we are driving toward is the goal of housing stability for all of our residents across the entire spectrum across the city." So HOST is really grounded in this mission of creating a healthy, housed, and connected Denver, where everybody has the benefit of that stable place to call home. We bring that work together, bring work that existed previously in a few different parts of the city. It's been brought together under this umbrella of HOST. So that includes work in our housing stability division that helps people stay in the homes that they're already in, really looking toward how do we prevent involuntary displacement. And then we also have our homelessness resolution work, which really helps to support folks who are experiencing an episode of homelessness, and how do we make sure they have the services that they need, but also the support to quickly regain housing, because we know the solution to homelessness is a home. And then lastly, we have work incorporated under our housing opportunity division, which is really a lot of what you'll think about when you think about development, adding affordable units and income restricted units to our housing stock. But all of that great work to help make sure people have access to home ownership and other programs also lives in that part of the department. So really exciting to be able to address kind of that full continuum of housing and homelessness response. So a little bit of history in terms of how we got to this 2021 action plan that Marty spoke about. So in January of 2020, as a new department, HOST set out to create a 5-year strategic plan. So our goal was to engage all of our stakeholders over the course of 2020 and come out of the end of 2020 with a 5-year strategic plan that was either adopted by council or making its way through that adoption process with council. Of course, in March, as we all know, because we are doing this by Zoom and not in person, the city really had to pivot alongside of our partners to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we weren't really able, as part of that process, the city and our partners have been doing a ton of work to make sure that folks experiencing homelessness are supported and have a safe place to stay. That work really took priority. And so we weren't able to do as much stakeholder engagement as we really wanted to and know we needed to for that long-term city plan. And so with our stakeholders that were involved in that process, we pivoted to a 1-year action plan. So I'm going to talk about tonight is just the work of 2021. And then toward the end, we'll talk about what that 5-year planning process is going to pick back up on. But this visual over here on the right-hand side of the screen just gives a bit of a snapshot of kind of how we got to this 2021 action plan and where we're going. Because the city's work had been kind of in our Department of Economic Development and Opportunity, as well as in Denver Human Services primarily, so a few other parts of the city, we have some existing plans that set some great vision and strategic priorities. So one of those is our Housing and Inclusive Denver Plan, which was the city's first 5-year housing plan. The second was a 3-year shelter strategy that really charted a vision for how do we do the sheltering component of our work better when we're responding to homelessness. The 2021 action plan tries to take from those strategies, create a roadmap for what are we going to do in 2021, how do we bridge to what's coming in the 5-year plan, but also, because we're a new department, how do we really articulate the work that we're stitching together across all of these plans and these different parts of the work that had been in other places in the city. So with that said, digging in a bit to the 2021 action plan, the vision that this plan articulates is really HOST's approach to the work is about investing, partnering, and creating policy across this full continuum of housing need. So whether someone is experiencing unsheltered homelessness, in a shelter, needing supportive housing, or market rate or workforce housing, affordable homeownership, what's our approach across all of those areas? And really across those approaches, we're seeking solutions that have 3 key components. They're person-centered, so we're meeting folks where they are. They're trauma-informed, and they're also data-driven and rooted in the best practices of what we know works. The 2021 action plan, if you haven't taken a peek at it, I can definitely pop the links to both of the documents I'm talking about tonight in the chat. But it does provide some data on community need in Denver to just ground our discussion of solutions and impacts. So there's a ton more in the plan, but just a few highlights. And I don't think this will come of any surprise. Everybody's feeling housing pressures. But housing costs in Denver have grown about twice as much as income. So housing, the cost of rent, the cost of a mortgage is vastly outpacing the income gains that folks are seeing. And that means that more households in Denver are spending more on housing. That leads to a situation that's called cost burden, which means you're spending more than 30% of your income toward your rent or your mortgage. And that's generally the level above which it might be hard to maintain that housing stability. You're not able to save. You're not able to you're making difficult choices between medical costs and paying for housing and those types of things. And we actually find with the market that we're in, 1 in 3 Denver households is experiencing that cost burden. And the challenge of that is really concentrated at the folks in our community with the lowest income levels. So I think it's 84% of people earning 30% of area median income or below are paying too much on their housing. We also see inequity in access to homeownership. This is a trend that we see nationally because of systemic racism that has existed in access to homeownership and housing markets in particular. But Black and Indigenous people of color have a homeownership rate of about 40% in Denver, as compared to 54% for non-Hispanic, non-Latinx white households. And then lastly, as Marty articulated at the beginning, we have seen homelessness rise in recent years. Between 2018 and 2020 in our point in time count, which is a single night census of the number of folks experiencing homelessness in Denver and communities across the country, we've seen a 21% increase in the number of folks that are either in our shelters, on our streets, in our transitional housing programs. We also see that BIPOC or Black and Indigenous people of color are overrepresented amongst those experiencing homelessness. So that is just a bit of background to one of the key pieces of this plan, which is an impact framework. So HOST is a new department, has a vision of healthy, housed, and connected. We're rooted in data that tells us that this is a significant community concern, that it's a growing issue, has been for a long time. Again, none of that is new information to you all, I'm sure. But this plan sets out a framework for how do we really understand what our impact is and how do we measure it. So there's a wonderful 2-page spread in our action plan that provides a lot of specific measurements, which we won't necessarily get into tonight, but I'm very happy to answer questions about it. But we've really tried to define what we seek to do in all of the areas of our department. What's the change we want to make and make with the community? So the first of those is to advance equity. We understand that housing is one of the areas that has really had a lot of policy that has been intentionally racist and exclusionary. And so how do we really do our work so that race no longer predicts outcomes around involuntary displacement, homelessness, home ownership, and cost burden? So how are we centering equity across the department's work toward that outcome? In our housing stability division, we're really trying to drive work to help folks have housing choice. So residents have choice in when and under what circumstances they move or remain in their homes and neighborhoods. So again, kind of rooted in that choice and also preventing involuntary displacement. For homelessness resolution, we're seeking to make sure residents experience homelessness rarely, and if they do, that it is a brief and one-time experience. And lastly, for our housing opportunity division, residents have equitable access to housing options that meet their needs with easy access to community resources. So folks have a choice in the neighborhood where they can live. They have access to things like transit-oriented development, communities that have childcare nearby, a lot of the amenities that we all value. With that impact framework, this next slide talks a bit about the specific goals for 2021. And these are some of the top line goals. You'll also see in the full plan that there's a bunch of detail that underlays that, which again, happy to pull up at the end if folks have more detailed questions or answer questions. But some of the high level goals for this year are to evaluate our department decisions through an equity framework and really building out a work plan for our department around equity, diversity, and inclusion. Mayor Hancock has an Office of Social Equity and Innovation that's really leading the city's work, and we're working in close partnership with them. We will also continue to lead COVID-19 community response, supporting residents experiencing homelessness and also folks that are facing housing instability. You know, we've had eviction moratoria that has helped folks stay in their home, but how are we thinking about, rental assistance and other programs that help people stay in their homes longer term? We will also be, of course, investing in the first year of homelessness resolution funds, and I'll talk a bit more about what that means in a minute. Across all of our investments, we're seeking to serve at least 21,000 households across different areas of the continuum, with 15,000 served in homelessness resolution. We will continue to be investing in development, really in line with the Housing Inclusive Denver priorities. Some of those are some of the things we talked about already in terms of access to transit-oriented development, preventing involuntary displacement, things of that nature. We will also be expanding outreach. Certainly folks have probably recognized that visible homelessness, folks sleeping on the street and in tents, is more apparent and increasing these days. And so how do we expand outreach to connect people to shelter, to services, and most importantly, to housing? And we are also, as part of COVID-19 response, seeking to implement at least 3 temporary managed campsites. And so the hosted just recently do a procurement for those services. You may have also heard those programs called Safe Outdoor Space. We will also be seeking to maintain and rebuild our pre-pandemic shelter capacity. So one thing as a bit of context, the COVID-19 pandemic, because we needed to create social distancing within congregate shelter settings to keep those spaces safe, we lost 56% of the existing beds that we had at the beginning of 2020. So the city and its partners have worked really closely to create hotel and motel options, to open additional facilities. But a goal for this year is definitely to continue to provide the beds that we need in a way that is safe, socially distanced, has access to testing, all of that work. We will also be looking to support critical policy and systems change efforts. So things like looking at eviction policy and where we can advocate or work with the state, things like affordable housing incentives and things that we can do to increase development. There's a whole list in the full plan. And then lastly, and again, we'll revisit this topic at the end, in 2021, HOST will be continuing the process of building our 5-year strategic plan. So we'll be continuing to engage stakeholders in the community over the course of this year to come up with that vision for 2022 to 2026. And this gives us a bit of a bridge to that plan. So that's a lot of things that we're doing. How does the funding come together, and what are the resources that we're working with to achieve that vision? So this chart just shows a bit of the budget for HOST. One thing to note is that this budget that I'm showing you here is the budget that's in our action plan, but it is a little bit different than the budget that's in the city budget book. That's for a few reasons to do with how things get accounted for and where some special funding for COVID gets accounted for in the budget book and things like that. So just wanted to preface, if you follow the city budget process, this might have been a little puzzling, but there's some reasons why. But you'll see we get funding from 5 primary funding sources now with the addition of the Homelessness Resolution Fund. So at the base, we have our $27 million of general fund budget. Then this blue section is our Affordable Housing Fund, which is our dedicated funding for affordable housing that Denver voters passed. I think it was back 2016, 2017, is before my time with the city. Affordable Housing Fund at $32.4 million. HOST receives federal funding, primarily from HUD for several different grants. And so that portion of our funding makes up about $31.3 million. And then we have just under $15 million in other funding. It's listed out specifically if you're interested in the line items of that in the action plan. But all of that together is about $106 million. So that was our budget picture when we did the draft of this plan, and we're finalizing the plan. And then, of course, as Marty mentioned, in November, Denver voters graciously and generously passed Initiative 2B, which gives us in 2021 an additional $37.1 million projected, bringing the total to just over $142 million. So the addition of the Homelessness Resolution Fund and those 2B dollars definitely add a significant portion to our overall picture. This next slide shows how those dollars are broken out by our different areas in the department. One thing to note is this does not account for that $37 million of 2B quite yet. We just posted our final plan to invest those dollars actually earlier today. So now we'll have some procurement process to allocate that, which will update this picture. But you can see that a large portion of our funding goes to our housing opportunity space, 47% to housing opportunity, 45% goes to our homelessness resolution area, 5% goes to housing stability, and 3% goes to operations. So things like contracts, finance, the inner workings of getting stuff done. One thing to note, you'll probably see that housing stability is a smaller portion by quite a large margin than our other outcome areas. Part of that is due to some of the funds that we receive can only be used in certain ways. So HUD funds or U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development funds often can only be used for specific purposes. A large portion of this budget too is the Affordable Housing Fund, which is guided by that Housing and Inclusive Denver plan. And stakeholders in that plan really emphasize the focus on development to create those long-term units that are affordable over time. So there's some limitations in how much funding we have in that stability area at this point. Also important to mention that funds that are in our HOST realm are not the only funds available working on housing and homelessness. And so we work in close coordination with our other city agencies, our statewide partners, such as Colorado Division of Housing and Colorado Housing Finance Authority, and other supportive partners like Denver Housing Authority, philanthropic partners, so private funders, foundations, folks that are also interested in this area. And then we have also been utilizing federal dollars for COVID-19 response. Federal dollars have really given the department and our partners a great way to expedite a lot of vision. One key point of our 3-year shelter plan was really moving from an overnight system where folks can come to a shelter in the evening, get dinner, sleep, and then need to leave in the morning, to a system that's more 24 hours. So folks can come when they need to, go to work when they need to, don't have to leave and find somewhere else to be during the day. That was hoped to be a 3-year implementation, and with COVID and the extra resources that we were able to garner both financially and through people time, we were able to expedite that to 6 weeks, which was amazing. And 2B, as we'll talk about in a second, really helps us maintain those gains after federal COVID response resources go away. All right, so switching gears, that's kind of the big picture. Where are we driving toward? So we're continuing to build units. We're continuing to invest in our shelter system and our outreach and solutions for folks experiencing unsheltered homelessness, helping folks with housing stability. But where does 2B fit in to that overall picture? Before we get into the investment plan, just want to offer a little bit of background on 2B, just to level set, though I totally understand many of you were probably involved in the campaign. So first off, if you were involved in the campaign, thank you. As Marty mentioned, in November, Denver voters passed 2B with over 60% support, which is great. This is an important new resource for our community to really help us provide those services that we need to provide. It's projected to create 37 million this year, just due to the economic conditions. However, we're hopeful that in future years, that number will be closer to 40 million. It's important to note, though, that it's a sales tax. And so actual will depend on, how much folks are consuming and all of those things. Importantly, the funds must be used for people experiencing homelessness or exiting homelessness. So we can't use these funds to do things further upstream, like eviction prevention or rental assistance for folks who are in their own housing, if they haven't come from that experience of homelessness. And that's just based on how the ordinance was written. Host needs to have a plan by January 31st. We just posted it today, so that is very exciting. But we can use the funds in a couple of ways: housing development, rental assistance, and supportive services, expanding shelter beds, creating 24/7 operations at shelter, as well as other services that folks might need, like integrated clinical care, and making sure we're connecting folks to those housing resources. The campaign that really tried to make the case for this resource to the Denver community identified that the fund would create 1,800 homes with support services over 10 years. So this is additional to what we would have been able to do with existing funds. We're also looking to create 500 to 600 new units of shelter or housing in projects that combine both of those things at the same location. Can be used to regrow our lost shelter capacity and also to expand those services. So since the measure was passed in November, we've been doing a community engagement process, which just recently wrapped up. So we've really, in our approach to 2B, we've been really looking at how do we look at what we already wanted to do in 2021 and really take that to the next level, or continue to do things that didn't necessarily have that identified funding sources I mentioned with those FEMA funds. So we started with our 2021 action plan, did a lot of listening sessions with community partners and with mayor's office and city council, and did a few different survey efforts to try to understand more broadly whether that plan felt like it was on the right track and what input the community had. So we surveyed, it was 149 community members just on how we proposed to use the first year of 2B funds. And overwhelmingly, we got really positive support. So just under 75% of folks supported the draft plan, which was great to see. Just under 15% felt neutrally about the plan, and 11% did not support the plan. Some high-level themes from the engagement that we did were that, really housing is the solution to homelessness. So how do we focus resources on housing as much as possible, while also recognizing that people need other things while they're in that experience of homelessness, whether that's outreach, whether that's support for shelter, how are we focusing on that whole continuum, which was consistent with the action plan. We also have strong values on person-centered approaches, culturally competent approaches, trauma-informed services, and also importantly, how are we integrating peers, so folks that have lived expertise of homelessness into our programs, as well as health services, which has just become increasingly critical, particularly in 2020 and 2021. And lastly, we heard just the need to preserve the flexibility. These are local funds. So we aren't bound by the rules that come with some of our HUD funds and things like that. So how do we use these funds in a way that preserves that flexibility so we can fill gaps that we need for our community? And taking all of that into account, this chart, and I'll talk through kind of what each of these categories mean a bit more on the next slide. But this chart just gives you the high level of how funds will be allocated this year, and this is the final. So you can see this portion here in red, 27% is for COVID response. We are expecting to need some local funding to continue those efforts. The largest portion, though, is going to go to housing and support services in line with the feedback that we received. A smaller portion, but still significant, of 24% or $9 million will be going to shelter and services. And then smaller portions for innovative approaches, so pilots or smaller programs that are maybe newer to our community that we're experimenting with. Catalytic development, which is again, those projects that combine shelter and housing at the same location. And then 2 smaller items for administration. So what funding for hosts to operate and use these funds wisely, report out on them, all of those good things. And then a small amount of $1 million in reserves, just to account for anything we didn't foresee at the beginning of the year. But importantly, those dollars roll over to the subsequent year, so we don't lose them if we don't spend them this year. This next slide definitely has a lot of text on it, so I will talk through it, but it really just is intended to illustrate the outcomes from each of those big areas of investment that we just walked through briefly. So COVID emergency response, because we have FEMA funds, which is great to be able to tap into. So FEMA is our federal emergency management agency, and they can help us cover the cost of emergencies, but it is on a reimbursement basis. And so we are expecting that we will need to use homelessness resolution fund dollars this year to cash flow some of the costs that we have for the pandemic response, but those costs will come back to the fund upon reimbursement. So hopefully later this year or in a future year, we're able to reallocate them. But we are planning to use 27% to support 800 rooms of activated respite and protective action. Those are hotel rooms that we're using to provide safe isolation opportunities for folks who are either COVID positive or who are COVID negative, but would have high risk of complications if they were to get the virus. So folks that are age 65 plus or who have other complicating health conditions primarily. So how do we support those rooms and make sure that there's a safe transition plan as we no longer need those rooms? For housing and service supports, this can provide funding for more housing programs. So programs with our nonprofit partners that help people pay their rent and give them case management so that they can maintain their rent going forward, for things like supportive housing, which is long-term rental assistance with support services to help people maintain that housing. And it can also be used for development. So we're expecting kind of within those combination of activities to be able to rehouse at least 500 additional households this year with programmatic assistance and fund the creation of at least 80 additional units of supportive housing. For the next category for shelter and services, large portion of this is really to focus on that 24/7 model articulated in the action plan, filling in those gaps where other resources will be going away. And that will support more than 430 beds in a 24/7 model and deepen services to provide critical things like help regaining housing and case management and integrated clinical care at an additional 700 beds. We don't have specific outcomes yet for innovative approaches because that will really depend on what pilots or small programs we fund. But then in the catalytic space, we're really, we do intend to issue a request for proposals to better understand the pipeline here, but we're hoping to fund the development of at least 100 units of new shelter and or housing this year. All right, so then next steps, final plan. I should have updated this slide as of like 2 o'clock this afternoon. The final plan is posted to our website. I think you all have these slides, so that link will take you to our About Us page where that's all located. But we'll be, final plan is posted. We'll now be moving into procurement to figure out how do we get these funds out as quickly as we can within existing city procurement processes. We'll be working with stakeholders on that. And then we're really ramping back up our community engagement for the 5-year strategic planning process. So starting in February, we have some existing stakeholder groups that we will be using for input, and we also have community surveys that we'll be issuing to get input at a few different stages of the plan. And that will really be the place to chart that long-term vision for how we're addressing housing and homelessness in Denver over the long term. And one thing too to think about with 2B is that the future uses of that fund after this first year will also roll into that 5-year plan process. So important community conversations to be had over the next year. We'll be seeking to get a draft out for public comment for the community to respond to in late summer, early fall, and then a final plan to City Council by, I think, November 1st is our deadline. So we'll be a busy year thinking big picture, dreaming about what we can be doing and how we have clear strategies and goals and metrics attached to that so that we can know if we're successful or not and how we're making progress. So exciting work to come. If you haven't already, we do have a host kind of newsletter, listserv group that you can join to be able to receive updates. So anytime we publish a survey, if we have any public engagement opportunities, those all get email blasted out to our listserv. So I'll also put the link where you can go to sign up for that in the chat. So folks can do that if they haven't already. But with that, I will stop talking and hopefully hear and be able to answer all of your questions.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was really excellent. Lovely slides, good presentation. We do have a few questions and hopefully more will come in the chat box. The first one is host giving any priority to homeless families, and what role should DPS have in that effort?
So that is a great question. So families experiencing homelessness is called out as a priority in both the action plan and the investment framework for the Homelessness Resolution Fund. Our 3-year shelter strategy set really important vision around 24/7 sheltering, but there was less in that plan specific to families. And so in the 2021 action plan, we've acknowledged that we need to really dig deeper on what are those best practices, what's the right approach for our community, for families. So that is definitely part of the plan for this year. But with 2B funds, we also are prioritizing making sure we're investing some of those housing and services dollars, as well as those shelter dollars in programs that serve families. So kind of a both and in that way. And I expect that conversation will continue in the 5-year plan process as well. And I think DPS is definitely an important partner in that long-term planning conversation. We certainly look at their data to understand homelessness amongst school-age children and important connections there. But I think that's an area to dig deeper in the conversations to come this year.
I believe you had mentioned something about sweeps. We had a question on, please comment on the sweeps, and disclosure from the person who asked. They seem like a wasted effort. Rather see sanitation and counseling provided for those expenditures. Any thoughts on that?
So cleaning and activity related to encampments is really subject to, it's primarily in our encumbrance removal area of the city, which is the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. There's also some activity that happens in public health. So what I can say, or for public health purposes, what I can say is that, you know, host's role in that is really to be a good partner with our city agencies and make sure that we are sending outreach workers, making sure we're connecting folks to services, because that is, as the person who's raised the question mentioned, you know, is critical. And so one thing that is new in 2020 that hosts received some additional dollars to expand outreach this year. And one targeted effort is called Street Outreach to Large Encampments, or SOUL, which is really sending you know, more social worker type folks out to those encampments and expanding our ability to engage there. So definitely the importance of those service connections, and then also transfer to our Denver Street Outreach Collaborative, which does deeper work on rehousing case management, is a priority for host.
Sort of a similar kind of question, I think, is what are you planning to do to stop the people who prey on the homeless and take advantage of them? Obviously, the homeless face personal safety issues, drug sales. This flows over into the surrounding residential neighborhoods then too.
Yeah, so I think, you know, that's another area of partnership. So if there are things happening in camps that are illegal, you know, certainly Department of Safety is the appropriate agency to engage in those situations. I can say that, you know, there will be a lot of attention paid to what is our long-term plan for supporting folks that are experiencing unsheltered homelessness, and also the correlate to that, which is how do we really support neighborhoods and engage in neighborhood mitigation. So that was something that we definitely heard about in our community listening sessions on 2B. And we've really identified that and articulated that as a deeper dive conversation for the 5-year plan process, just to be able to bring those partners together, but always working in coordination with our other city agencies.
Why is the city still allowing developers like River Mile to eliminate affordable units after a certain period of time, like 30 or 40 years?
So some of that might, I'm not as much of an expert. I'm growing in my knowledge of our housing opportunity division. I've been with Host for about 1.5 years now. So that's definitely an area where I am still learning. But I believe it has really been our priority to extend the length of time on those covenants to things that are more in the 60-year, or I think even with our DHA Delivers for Denver project, which is supporting land acquisition for deeply affordable and supportive housing units. We've been doing covenants on the land that last 99 years. So really trying to look toward those long-term opportunities where we can.
There was another question that's similar about zoning. Is there a connection between Host and the zoning changes enabling group living growth?
So Host is a participant in the group living zoning project. That project is led by Community Planning and Development, and they've had a group that has come together, I think over 2 years plus now, really digging into those discussions. And so we've had Host represented at those tables and continue to be a partner to CPD in that. Group living, for folks who might be a little less familiar, has some proposed changes this year that would update the definition of a household so that more unrelated adults could live together in the same household to support housing stability and co-living situations. But then it also, for homelessness resolution, would clarify zoning for shelters. One thing, the city has leased a shelter out at 48th in Colorado, which is a fairly industrial area of town. And that is the location because there's pretty limited, based on current zoning rules, it's pretty limited where we can site shelters. So of course it would be better to be able to offer those opportunities, places that are more connected to services, more connected to transit, but we are pretty limited in the current zoning.
Interesting. So are there grants to mental health providers?
So we provide funding through competitive procurement. So certainly mental health care providers, if they had a proposal that fit in with the overall objectives, would be welcome to apply. There's also the Caring for Denver Foundation, which has a dedicated funding stream for behavioral health needs too. So we want to make sure, we're coordinating. That was one of the private funders that we coordinate with in kind of that budget section. So we want to make sure we're not duplicating effort, but certainly if, an agency provided mental health services and wanted to apply, they'd be welcome to. With COVID response, we have been integrating clinical care at shelters. So that means providing, touch points for primary medical, behavioral health, substance misuse, kind of co-located with shelters. So looking to continue those approaches while also making sure we tap relevant healthcare funding.
That sounds good. This said, with a new administration, any plans to work with HUD for further funds for housing? Sorry.
Yeah, so we definitely work with the mayor's office in kind of the overall city, legislative advocacy work, and definitely provide feedback and support for that process. So I don't personally know kind of what our agenda will be with the Biden administration and the mayor's office, but really excited to see the additional dollars that rolled out just recently through Department of Treasury for increased rental assistance, so that we can really start to fill that gap for folks that are in their homes but need support to stay there. So definitely we always look at all of those HUD funding opportunities really closely. Sometimes those come through DHA, Denver Housing Authority, and I know they also look at those closely as well.
There's a couple of questions about, I think, more specifics. So can you give us some specifics of some successes? Can you tell us a little more about the homeless population? And someone asked, have you heard Aurora Mayor Mike Hoffman's report on a week on the streets in both Aurora and Denver? Any learnings from that? So I think it's just some general ideas about your successes and the populations that you serve.
Absolutely. So I think some real successes, as much as 2020 was a challenging year for so many, it also really pushed us to try new things and serve folks differently. And so I think as I mentioned, we expedited our 3-year implementation timeline for 24/7 shelter to 6 weeks, which is phenomenal. We had great support from Colorado National Guard at one point. Just so many different partners came together to make that possible. But what we've really seen is when we can provide those 24/7 services, people are able to engage with their case manager. They're able to sign up for housing choice voucher lottery. They're able to get connected to our system that coordinates housing resources for folks experiencing homelessness. So it has created some important stability and well-being and reduced anxiety. So curious to see kind of how we benchmark some of those successes and see how that moves going forward. We are also continuing to create units. So I can also link to our affordable housing dashboard, which shows how many units we're creating, where and what neighborhoods, but that work continues. The DHA Delivers for Denver project that I mentioned is a bond initiative that helps with land acquisition to create, I think it's 1,200 units of deeply affordable or supportive housing. Which is great. We know that the solution is those homes, so it's great to have those innovative strategies to do that. So a lot of good successes. Our partners are great collaborators in this work. In terms of data and how we understand who's experiencing homelessness in Denver, there are some additional charts and things in the action plan that would potentially be interesting to check out, but just to emphasize a few points. Historically, our primary data source for understanding homelessness in our community, this is similar to other communities nationally, is the point in time count. So that single night census. And so in that count, we know we have 4,171 folks who were counted in late January in 2020. That number has gone up, as I mentioned, over time. We see people of color are disproportionately in that number. We see folks who are gender nonconforming or transgender disproportionately unsheltered. We're also seeing an overall aging of the population of folks experiencing homelessness, and that's consistent with national trends. So we're seeing, consistent demographic trends and also kind of that aging piece as well. annually our One Home system, which is a coordinated effort to match folks experiencing homelessness with available housing for the Metro Denver region. We assess 2,000 households every year, and we house a smaller number of than that. So the demand for housing and these services and these solutions is more than the supply. 2B helps with that, but it doesn't solve it. We want to create 1,800 units of supportive housing over the next 10 years, but we assess 2,000 households annually. Many of them need that level of resource. So we continue to do the best with what we have, and we also need to continue to rely on other funding streams and coordination and figure out how do we maximize that. One other thing, just from a data perspective, that we're excited about is that we've invested pretty heavily in the homeless management information system, which is an integrated database on homelessness services. So providers can use that, and it's a shared data system across providers. And so that will really start to be really giving us better intelligence about how many people are experiencing homelessness over the course of the year and where do people seek services, and just gives us way more ability to dig in than the PIT was able, or the point in time count was able to provide. So exciting progress there really in the past year or two that will be helpful as we continue to do this work. With regard to Mayor Kaufman's recent, I think he spent a week staying in camps and in shelters in Denver and Aurora. I think it is, this is an issue of huge concern. We need regional partnerships and regional collaboration. And so I think it's great to have elected officials who are passionate about the issue. And I think, Denver is a housing first city. We believe that housing is the solution to homelessness in the long term. Certainly there are a lot of things we need to do along that continuum, but glad to have regional partnership. That's critical, and excited to see, if we have a lot of community interest in homelessness, how do we really leverage that for things that are going to be impactful?
It doesn't end on a particular street line, does it, between cities? That's
correct. Yeah, we Metro Denver Homeless Initiative, if you all, maybe you've heard of them, maybe you haven't, they are our continuum of care lead for Metro Denver. So they help us organize efforts across the 7-county Metro Denver region. Because if you're in Aurora, or you're in Denver, or you're in Adams, or if you take a quick bus up to Boulder, it's all connected.
Nice. So this is an interesting question. What was the 11% who did not approve of the plan unhappy about? So it's sort of the headlines, right?
Yeah, I think, we want to do a bit of a deeper dive into exactly those respondents to help us with 5-year plan. But generally the big concerns that we heard about in a range of our survey efforts between the action plan and 2B is just the concern about unsheltered homelessness. Folks are really looking for solutions there, which is totally understandable. We are too. And so that was definitely a key theme that came out of our 2021 action plan feedback. So again, reiterating the importance of expanding those outreach strategies and doing those things, but we'll be doing a deeper dive too into those respondents here in the coming weeks.
Nice. We have a couple of questions about money, about funds. So how are you able to change the admin cost from 3% as promised in the ballot issue to 6% in your latest 2021 plan that you showed?
So the ordinance for 2B lets host take up to 8% of just that 2B portion for administration. So we are planning to take 6% this year. So not the full amount we're eligible to take because we really want to put as many of those funds out in the community as we can. We also recognize that we need to make sure we have adequate contracting capacity, communications to coordinate and support neighborhoods, data and reporting, finance, all of those things that happen behind the scenes. So we are taking 6%, but not that full 8%. I think maybe the 3% that's mentioned was from that pie chart that I showed. That's our 2021 budget pre-2B, which is not stated as far as I'm aware of like a maximum cap for that. But that's kind of with the whole portion of host funds in mind. And so 2B is a smaller denominator, which is why it's a larger percentage.
So is there insufficient quantity of housing, or is it just too expensive for many people? With $40 million, you could subsidize at $100,000 each, 400 households.
So if we're thinking about markets, right, it's both and, right? So when you have more supply, price goes down. And so what we've seen is that demand for housing in Denver, as measured by household growth, has exceeded the creation of new units. So the exact percentages are in the action plan, but I think we saw 13% or so household growth. So we have 13% more households looking for housing. The state of Colorado was at 9%, and nationally that percentage is 5%. So we are growing rapidly in terms of households who need housing. And this is common, this is not unique to Denver's housing market, but supply of housing is slow to catch up. And so supply of housing grew at a lower rate. And so it's increasing, but not more than demand, which is why you see those prices continue to rise. So that was, I think I forgot the other part of that question. Pearline, can you help me out?
Sure. Yeah, that was $40 million, $100,000 each, 400 households.
Yeah, so 40 million depends on what benchmark you're looking at. I think one benchmark we often use when we think about how far do funds go, particularly in the homelessness resolution space, is the annual cost for permanent supportive housing. So that's rental assistance for someone plus pretty significant supportive services to help them maintain that housing. That intervention can cost around $20,000 a year. A little bit shy of that, but that's the round number. So when you think about how far that goes, gets you a little farther. I'm not going to try to do math on the top of my head in this largest setting, but that's often a benchmark that we use for thinking about other interventions where folks might need, help with rent for a few months, but then they can maintain it later. There are lower costs associated there. So definitely a range of costs, but we're kind of across the portfolio of supporting development of new units and a mix of rental assistance and support service packages, looking at, again, those 500 households served in programmatic assistance this year and creating 80 units.
So it's an interesting mix of real estate and services. The next two questions are about services. What is the plan for using funds for social workers at new shelter and housing plans, as the social workers help in breaking the cycle?
Yeah, so really deepening services within our shelter system and continuing to provide that support and housing is critical. So when we think about kind of that 24% of 2B that's for shelter and services, large portion of that is for things like case management. Oftentimes that's a social worker, maybe not all the time, but people in kind of that similar vein. So things like working with someone, you need actually a lot of documents to rent an apartment. If you don't have your IDs, if you don't have various things, people need support in really pulling those things together. They need help with apartment search, help with employment and income strategies, a whole range of things. And so we've been able, 24/7 operations has helped with a lot of those activities, but we're also looking to deepen those services, those types of services at 700 additional beds this year with 2B. That support is also important in housing. And so the housing division of the city, before we became host, did a lot of work to really look at what are quality supportive services and supportive housing. And that has led to additional financing, not through 2B, but through some of our existing dollars to create gap financing for support services. So when we're bringing new supportive housing online in Denver, we know that they have the right funding to create, to provide that quality level of support service. So that was an exciting win from the Housing and Inclusive Denver plan.
Any education programs, GED support, that kind of thing?
So I think that's often something more that folks would get connected to through their case manager. Off the top of my head, I don't know that we provide any, specific funds for that. We do have employment programming through the Denver Day Works program and some specific employment options. But we do, for programs that have case management, kind of look at how are they connecting folks to training programs, professional certifications, those types of things.
So you mentioned that one of the goals was to have, if someone experienced homelessness, it would be one time, right? So what part of the homeless population is rotating and what percentage is long-term?
Great question. That is something that we are going to be, I'm really excited to be able to dig deeper into now that we have that better homeless management information system, because that will let us start to see, okay, we served this person, we helped them get into housing. Did they show up back at one of our shelters at some point in the next year? And if you look at that action plan, we talked through some of the big impacts HOST is looking to create, but we also have outcome measures around that. And one of those is to measure those returns to homelessness. So we don't necessarily know today, but it's something we're really looking to benchmark this year.
That sounds great. Data. I work with data, so all that data is really important.
Yeah.
That's the end of the questions in chat. Marty, did you want to take over? Should we open it up if anybody had any remaining questions?
Well, I think we've really put Jennifer on the hot seat here. I think because we have cared about this for so long and are so passionately concerned about it that it, we don't mean to shoot the messenger.
Those are great questions. I appreciate it.
No, I appreciate we're known for our questions. Anyway, thank you, Jennifer. If someone else does have something, that's, we're okay, but thank you, because you really did have to answer a lot of things, and we appreciate your everything that you're trying to do, and we hope that we can see some good progress from all this. We really do. So thank you all. Good turnout.
Marty, I do have something.
Okay.
Marty, I do have something to sort of end on. Jennifer, I am in a lot of community meetings, and the issues with the homeless, because it's so close in the residential areas, is getting to be very heated. And I don't know if you could have some sort of program that would calm things down on both sides. We're having some of the partners that are getting very vocal, and it's not getting pleasant. And we need to have them calm down in order to explain things to residents and feel like the residents are being heard also. So if there's anything at all you can do that way, I know your survey didn't ask about that kind of thing, but that's really important, because no program will be successful if you have too much tension. So I'd appreciate anything you can do with that.
Thank you, Cindy. I'm glad you brought that up. I think that certainly, while it didn't necessarily, wasn't a specific question in the survey, it was something that we heard about in the listening sessions that we did. And so I think for HOST, part of kind of growing our ability to support 2B and our other funds is expanding our communications team and our community engagement. So that's something that we're looking at HOST in terms of what that looks like. But we definitely heard that need for just community support. I know, some neighborhoods have had those relationships ongoing with their service provider partners, but definitely looking at what's our role for that? And I think, because we've wanted to think more about it, it's kind of in that, how are we going to think about it long-term in that 5-year plan process, but we're also working on building our ability to support that work internally.
Perhaps a plan for our country, the tensions between various groups, and trying to improve our civic engagement with everyone, with all the sides, is a goal I know the League is certainly concerned about. Jeanette, go ahead.
I don't know if it's HOST or it might be the City Housing Authority, but is someone looking into creative, less expensive forms of housing? I hear you talking about units, and I don't know what a unit consists of, but I'm thinking of co-op housing, group living, tiny houses, different, not just a motel room and a shelter, but different things that might be long-term, but combining, the expenses of living so that it's not as expensive to provide housing.
Thank you. That's another great question. So part of that is part of that group living zoning code update that we talked a little bit about before. So the group living project, which is part of or is led by community planning and development, the current zoning allows for 2 unrelated adults to live in a housing unit together. And so the update to the zoning code would allow for up to 5. Within that, you can have any number of related folks in your household, which is the same as this currently. But that update helps us be able to support legally kind of more shared housing options. We did also do this, or CPD did some updates to the zoning code to allow for tiny homes too. So HOST provides supportive service dollars to Colorado Village Collaborative, or has $20 for Colorado Village Collaborative for their tiny home work. And so that's something that we are supporting. There's also, HOST participates with CPD and things like accessory dwelling units and other things. With 2B funds, though, we do have that funding set aside for innovative approaches. So we won't quite yet know what all of that looks like. But there are some ideas called out in there. I think tiny homes might be called out in there, manufactured housing, just different options. Because kind of the traditional, building multifamily housing, that, takes a while to bring online. There's just some ability to need to look at other solutions. So we're doing some of that. And I think we'll also see kind of what comes from some of these CPD processes and also our kind of innovative approaches.
All right, thank you. And we'll hope for a peaceful day tomorrow. So good night to everyone. And thank you again, Jennifer.
Thank you all. And I'll email Marty and Andrea and Peg with some links because I didn't actually get to them in the chat, just so you have those resources.
Why didn't you get to them?
Didn't quite get a moment. So if you guys could circulate that would be amazing. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.